people in the audience, feel free to ask questions as we go along. We have plenty of time here tonight, so feel free to interrupt and ask questions. For those online, if you do want to ask a question, again, Christina is kind of controlling the virtual option. If you have a question, please raise your hand, the virtual hand that is on there, and then we will go ahead and then you can unmute yourself and ask the question. We're going to try to do our best to repeat any question from the audience so that people online can hear the question asked. Okay. First things first, there are a couple people I want to introduce. First, I'd like to introduce my staff that are here. We have Debbie Raley, who's our Deputy Water Commissioner for the area. Thank you, Debbie, for coming. And of course, we have Betty Kraft, who's our Lead Water Commissioner for the area. We have Christina Redmond. Christina Redmond is our Administrative Assistant as well as our Well Permit Specialist. And then we have Willie Summers. And Willie Summers is my right-hand person as far as another engineer working with me. So just wanted to introduce those staff from Division 6. Most importantly, though, tonight, Jason Coleman is with us. He's our state engineer. And he and I are going to tag team this presentation. But it's a great opportunity. This is Jason's first opportunity to come up here since he was appointed state engineer. And I think it's been about 11 months, maybe 12 months ago that he was appointed state engineer. So really excited to have him up here. So I'm going to start with the presentation, and I'm going to keep trying to figure out this microphone and why it's giving feedback, but if I have to abort, I will. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're going to talk about the designation of the White River as over-appropriated. And so, why are we here tonight? How did we get here? And I will tell you that my office went through an evaluation of whether or not this basin should be designated over-appropriated in order to protect senior water right holders. In that process of doing this evaluation, we did prepare a report that outlines our findings as to whether or not this basin should be designated over-appropriated. But even prior to that, what prompted us to do this evaluation? We did this evaluation and as a result of some calls on the White River. As many of you are aware of, we had a call on the White River starting in December of 2022. That call ran through, I think, about April of 2023 when the flows of the White River exceeded the water rights. Well, really the structure's capacity, but it's the water rights. So anyway, so once the water right was being met and even exceeded, we took the call off. And then we had another call at the end of July that same year, 2023. That call ran all the way till I think it's about January 2024. There was a short break in that call in September due to some maintenance requirements that the structure had to do. But that call came off in January. That was a little bit different reason why they took that. We had to take the call off then. They had some maintenance issues where they were unable to take the entire flow of the river through their turbine and put it to beneficial use. So similar to any irrigation ditch, for example, let's say we're on Peons Creek and the Metzen Reagan ditch, they have to sweep the river and in order for us to honor that call and put that all the water in the system to beneficial use. No different with Taylor Draw Conduit. They have to be able to put all the water in the river to beneficial use or the call comes off. And so that's what happened in January. They've been doing a lot of work to repair everything and do the maintenance necessary at Taylor Draw. And it's my understanding that it's hopeful that that turbine will be up and running this April. It's also my understanding that the desire is to continue to request a call when flows drop below their water rights. So all of this really prompted us to take a more serious approach to this designation of the over-appropriation. And when I say approach, is really think hard about it and start putting some efforts into action. So with all that said, after we had completed that evaluation, we've had these calls. I did ultimately make a recommendation to the state engineer in the fall. It was either November or December. I made a recommendation to the state engineer that the basin upstream of Taylor Draw be designated over-appropriated. So that's really why we're here tonight. We want to talk about the designation of the basin over-appropriated and what that means for everybody in the community. But first, let's understand what over-appropriation means. So over-appropriation is a stream system that a stream system is considered over appropriated when there is the stream system is considered over appropriated when at all or sometimes of the year, there's not enough water available in the stream system to meet all the demands, to meet all the water right needs. So, so that's really for the most part what over appropriation means. And so what might cause a stream to become over appropriated? You know, obviously we've been in this area. People have been diverting water for well over a century in this area. Why all of a sudden are we seeing a system being designated over appropriated? And it's really all about supply and demand, right? Is the supply of water gone down, and or has the demand gone up? And things that can cause the demand to go down are things like new water rights. And I will tell you that the majority of my days are spent with the water court. And I can tell you right now that, yes, there are new appropriation and new water rights being applied for all the time. So we know that there is an increased demand from just people's use of water. Another thing that can affect the increased demand is new wells. We assume all wells are tributary to the stream system. In other words, when you pump water from a well, it is going to affect the stream. So if we see an increase in well drilling and well pumping, that's going to affect the flows of the river. And then lastly, we really can't dismiss the fact that as we see temperatures increasing, you are going to, that does result in a higher crop consumptive use. And what does that mean? Some of you might, but I don't see how that affects anything. If your crops are consuming more, less water returns. And the water that returns is obviously vital and critical to all downstream water users. So those are things that can cause the demand to go up. So what were some of the things we considered during our evaluation? There's no doubt that when we get a call on a system, that's going to say, hey, that is an immediate sign to us. Is there more water appropriated on that system than there is a supply? And so anytime we have, I'll pause here for a minute and just say, a basin can be designated over appropriated without a call, but the call is a real clear indicator that there's a chance that the basin has become over appropriated. So that's one thing we're looking at and evaluating. We also have to ask ourselves whether or not there has been low flow years when there could have been a call, but an owner may be elected not to. And I can tell you that it hasn't been any new conversation with downstream users in the Rangeley area about low flows in the White River, whether it's town of Rangeley or whether it was Rio Blanco Water Conservancy District. It's been for years that there's been concerns about the low flows down there, and it's only been since 2022 that some type of action was taken. So we know this happens. It happens more than just on the White. It happens on tributaries all the time, where there's not enough water to go around, but somebody's electing to not place a call. And then we already talked about historic flows declining a little bit, just that supply going down. I'm also here in a little bit going to show a graph to show you how supplies have gone down. Now the graph I'm going to show you is at the very bottom of the system, and that graph is obviously going to indicate that there's not only a decrease in supply, but also potentially a decrease in demand. So those are the things we, for the most part, look at. We also, again, are just looking at, how much water has been appropriated versus how much water is available. And then we also look at any other things that might have warranted this designation. So let's get into the part of the river that's going to be designated over appropriated. So it's important to recognize that some of the White River tributaries were already designated over appropriated. And so that nothing's going to change in those basins. Nothing's going to change in Piance Creek. Nothing's going to change in Yellow Creek as far as well permitting or anything else. Those areas have already been designated over appropriated. And this map shows the White River Basin and those areas that were already designated over appropriated. Some of them many, many years ago were they designated over appropriated. So what is actually going to become over appropriated? I'm glad that shows up better for you than it does me. Looking at this, you can see that everything in the pink peachish color is already in, we're talking, this is Division 6 now. So we've zoomed out from the White River to Division 6. Everything in the pink is already designated over appropriated in Division 6. And everything in the green is not over appropriated. And the yellow is representing what will become over appropriated on the White River. And then lastly, I just want to show a graph, or a photo of the state. Now, of course, you're like, well, that's not the entire state. we know that the entire eastern slope has been over appropriated for a century. And so there's no point in showing that. But what I am trying to show on this little portion of the western part of the state is that everything there in that bluish color is the areas that have not yet been designated over appropriated. And I think the message to take away from this is you could see that most of the state is over appropriated. We've been living in an over appropriated world for quite some time in the majority of the state. And then you have that oval that I'm showing there that will be the area that would become over appropriated. So let's take a look at this graph. I told you I was going to show you a graph. This again, I'm looking at the Watson gauge in Utah. It's the furthest down gauge on the White River. And I really like this gauge because it does have over 100 years of data. So you can really look at what has happened over time at that gauge. What the blue dots represent is the total volume of water that went past that gauge in any given year. So it does look funny because it's just a dot representing a volume of water, but again, that's represent as a dot representing each year and total volume of water that went past that gauge. And then I just put a trend line on it. So the trend line you can see is a decrease in the average flow that has gone past that Watson gauge, to the extent that in 1924, the average flows in the White River were 520,000 acre feet, and in 2024, just over 100 years after that, 440,000 acre feet. So a decrease in about 15% of the water going past the Watson gauge. So kind of getting into how this affects you, how does over-appropriation affect you? For the most part, Jason's going to speak to this, but there's two things I do want to speak to. And that is, how does designating the basin over-appropriate the ability to get a surface water right? And I will tell you, it doesn't. People can continue to come and, people can continue to appropriate water, come to court and get a water right. They just need to be aware that that water may not always be available for them. They are going to be the most junior on the system, and they will be the first to be curtailed during a call. So they just need to be aware of that when they start developing their water project. And then next, let's talk about existing wells. If you have an existing well, this designation is not going, and I should say an existing permitted well, this designation is not going to affect you. However, if for some reason you do need to come into our office and change your well permit for any reason, for example, to change the uses, it will depend on what you're wanting to do and how much land you're located on. Honestly, if you're on 35 acres or more, or 35 acres or less, it'll depend on whether or not you can get a well permit without an augmentation plan. So now I think the important topic is what's going to happen to getting what happens when you get new well permits. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason now, and he's going to talk about that aspect.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Since this is the first time I've been to Meeker since becoming state engineer late March, so I have been state engineer for 11 months. I consider myself still to be the new state engineer. That gives me some freedom to make mistakes, which there's a lot to learn, but just a little background on myself. I spent 17 years on the West Slope. I grew up in the Front Range. My family has, my parents, both my sides of my family, farmed on the Front Range. And I grew up in Fort Collins. I moved to the West Slope after working as an engineer on the Front Range with a consulting firm for about 9 years, and deciding I wanted to get out of the Denver area, and now I moved back. But in Montrose, I was in Montrose for 17 years. 3 years of that, I was the city engineer for the city of Montrose, and then for the remaining 14 years, I was the assistant division engineer and then the assistant state engineer. So I do have some experience on the Western Slope. I had to move to the other side to take this job. State engineers in statute, the office is in the Capitol complex, and the commute from Montrose to the Capitol complex is really not all that feasible to do on a weekly basis. So anyway, but I'm glad to be back here on the West Slope. I graduated from CSU, and I've had some people say, is that Auburn? Did you graduate from Auburn? it's for the Aggies, actually. I presented to the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association 2 weeks ago, and the dean of the Ag College gave me this Aggie pin. So just in case, I don't want anybody to think I graduated from the Southeast. So, so on to the topic for this evening, and how an over-appropriation designation will affect the issuance of new well permits. And I will say, from my experience in Montrose, in the Division 4 office, which is the Gunnison River Basin, I wasn't there when the entire Gunnison River Basin was declared over-appropriated, but that happened not long before I got there in 2003, after the 2002 drought, when it's a similar situation to here, where the Redlands Power Canal made a call 2 times in a row, and that resulted in the Gunnison Basin being declared as over-appropriated because of the lack of supply that was demonstrated through that call. The process was actually a little less formal at that time, and the division engineer basically just sent a letter to the state engineer saying, this is my critical areas. And so we've developed this probably a little better process that involves, talking to the stakeholders and informing everybody on what that's going to, how that's going to affect the issuance of well permits primarily. But there are 2 types of well permits, so explaining that first is important. So an exempt residential well permit is a permit that, as it indicates, is exempt from the prior appropriation system. And so it is not considered injurious because the legislature has determined that for the economy, for people to have a water supply, they can get a well if they meet these certain criteria. And that is in over-appropriated basins. So in areas that are over-appropriated, you can get a well permit for both exempt and non-exempt uses. But this slide explains there's a flow chart of residential well permits that are exempt. So if it is over-appropriated, so go up to the top there, if you have a lot less than 35 acres, then you can get an in-house use only permit. If you have a lot that's greater than 35 acres, you can get domestic use, which domestic use for the purposes of a well permit is considered 3 single-family homes on 1 lot, irrigation of up to 1 acre of lawn and garden, and watering of domestic animals, which means animals for your own use generally. It's not, a chicken house or a horse boarding operation. It's for your own use. And then if the basin is not over appropriated, then it doesn't matter on your lot size. You can get that domestic use that includes 3 single-family dwellings and irrigation of 1 acre and watering of domestic animals on any size of lot. So this is maybe just that shows all the different types of exempt well permits. So if you have a parcel of 35 acres or more, you can get that up to 3 houses. If you have a parcel less than 35 acres, you can get household use only. So this is exempt from the prior appropriation system in an over-appropriated basin. Or if your lots were divided prior to June 1st of 1972, or divided exempt from subdivision regulations. So if you have a exempt subdivision where you've divided like a minor subdivision where you did a 3-lot subdivision, that also would count. And then there's a provision for commercial exempt and livestock. So for non-exempt wells, which become more important in an over-appropriated basin, the designation between the 2 becomes more important. If the basin is over-appropriated, I'm trying to not feedback here. Is it okay? Mm-hmm. It's echoing up here, but so if the basin is over-appropriated, then you must have an augmentation plan in place or contract for augmentation water with a provider, or you can go to water court and get an augmentation plan by drying up acreage or some other purpose. But you have to provide replacement supply if you want a well that is doing more than those exempt purposes. If you don't meet the criteria for the exempt well, then you must have an augmentation plan in an over-appropriated basin. And the reason is because the wells that you drill here along the White River, they take water from the alluvium, which takes water from the stream. So do exempt wells do that? Yes. But the legislature's decided that that's necessary to allow those things to happen. If you talk to Aaron Clay, who teaches a water law in a nutshell class to realtors, he calls it legal fiction that's created. But for non-exempt wells, you have to have an OG plan to replace those depletions from pumping the well. And so that is what is changing here with the over-appropriated status. I mean, Aaron's staff have already administered the stream for these calls, so that's not going to change. When there's a call, we have to administer the stream system, but we don't administer, the wells, and because we don't have well rules in place here. So, but when we issue well permits is when we determine whether you need an OG plan or not. So if the basin's not over appropriated, you can get a well for any use, or you can construct a pond that is considered a pit well. So I think we have a slide later here that describes examples of non-exempt wells, and that includes ponds that intercept groundwater. And so if you dig a pit and you want to create a pond and it just fills up with water because there's groundwater in it, that is what we would term a pit well. It would require in an over-appropriated basin an augmentation plan. And the reason is because we can't do anything about the evaporation that's occurring. That evaporation is taking water away from the senior water right holders. So irrigation wells, commercial wells used for non-exempt purposes, industrial wells typically, and then any domestic wells that don't qualify for exempt status would be considered non-exempt wells that would need an augmentation plan. And so I think we've already maybe covered a little bit of this, but why is well permitting change? Well, because once we know that there's not enough supply to meet all the water right demands, and the groundwater is tributary to the surface water, it's hard to justify continuing to issue non-exempt well permits, knowing that a senior water right in some portion of the year is not getting the water they're entitled to under their water right. And so, when a junior surface water right is causing injury to senior water right, the junior surface water right can be curtailed and shut off. We don't do that with wells typically, right? Unless we have well rules, which in divisions 1, 2, and 3, we have well rules that have gone through the full rulemaking process that allow us to do administration of wells. We do not have that in any of the West Slope basins. Wells, on the other hand, I think I've already explained this, can't be turned off. Depletions from wells are delayed. So you need a Glover or some kind of model to determine how much water is actually being depleted from the stream when you pump these wells. And so that's why you need augmentation water to replace those depletions. In basins that aren't over appropriated, which there are becoming less and less of them around the state, but essentially the assumption is that there's adequate water supply for all the vested water rights. And a lot of the times that's because there hasn't been a call. Nobody has expressed a need for the water that they're entitled to under their water right to the division engineer's office in those basins. And the state engineer, like we've said, can issue well permits without injury to surface water rights in those cases. And in over appropriated basins, that's not the case. We cannot continue to issue well permits and make a finding that there's no injury to the surface water rights, when we know that there's times a year when the stream doesn't have enough water in it for all the water rights. So what is the plan for augmentation? And I think I've mentioned briefly that essentially it's a plan to replace out of priority depletions and to replace them in time, place, and amount that the senior water right would need it. So if you're replacing your depletions, 5 months in the wintertime when the senior water right was needing it in the summer, that's not an effective augmentation plan. But that's the simple thing. Now, what things can be used as sources? Typically, storage water. So people will change water in storage buckets for augmentation. That water has to also be able to make it to the senior water right. People sometimes in many places will, if they really need a well to supply water to some other use and they want to change, they would then dry up some land and they would have an engineer calculate how much that dried up land actually essentially provides the system. How much water did that save the system? Has to be enough then to allow that well to pump, and it has to be in the time that that well is going to be pumping and the depletions are made to the stream. In some basins, not the White River that I'm aware of, they have where they've been over appropriated for long periods of time. Some entities such as conservancy districts have decreed blanket augmentation plans where a person that wants to get a well can go to that conservancy district and tell them that we're building a house and there's a formula for how much depletion that will cause. And then they can pay this conservancy district for amount of water out of the conservancy district's pool in some storage bucket. That's not the case in the White River. Betty's shaking her head. No, right now. But it hasn't been over appropriated. I don't know if there's even any buckets that would be possible with, but those are some possible sources of augmentation water. And so why do we formally designate basins as over appropriated? Because, as we've already said, it's necessary to protect water right holders from impacts of future groundwater development. Because without that formal designation, we cannot deny those well permits or require augmentation. I shouldn't say deny, require augmentation for non-exempt well permits. We're affecting the well permit designation. It's not affecting how the stream is administered. That's still going to remain the same. And can you still get junior water rights? Yes. This doesn't affect the ability to obtain a junior water right, because a junior surface water right, and maybe there's a time of the year in the spring when you want to get a flood water right, which I'm assuming people will get water rights to take water during spring runoff when the water is still available. But when that water peters out later in the season, Erin and her staff can actually curtail those uses, unlike wells. So, I meant to tell you all you could ask questions throughout this presentation, but now that we're at this 1 or 2 slides from the end, maybe we'll just finish out and then you can ask any questions that you might have of Erin or I. But the process from here is that Erin's already requested that I designate the White River as over appropriated. I think that it's a fairly clear-cut case of it being over appropriated since there's been calls from senior water right holders. And so I would write a letter officially designating the White River as over appropriated. And the intent right now for time frame is that that letter would indicate that as of May 1st of 2025, so we would have almost 2 months here between this week and when the official designation occurs. On May 1st of 2025, that's when our well permitting staff, when they evaluate well permits, would be considering the basin as over appropriated. And we would give a grace period through December 31st of 2025 for folks that have wells that were drilled or were in the process of being drilled prior to May 1st and would like to get that well permit without augmentation. They would have through the end of the year to file an application for that well permit and would be considered. We would be considering it and evaluating it as being applied for while it was not over appropriated, just to give people some grace period of time to adjust to this designation. So from the time that I send out this letter or sign this letter, you have 30 days to comment about this as well. So I guess a little more than 30 days, but I think, and some explanation on how you can find well permit information on Colorado Decision Support System. So this is our homepage. Well permitting is a big block there on the upper right, upper left. If you click on that, it takes you to this page and there's a well permit search. So if you want information on your well permits, you click that button and it takes you to this page where you can select your division. So division 6, or you could select your district. And then you would, you can select, if you go to more options, you can pick permit number, you can pick receipt number. There's a number of options that you can search by. And then if you pick a search for a large area without like a permit number, you might get a large number of well permits here that you can search through. And you can click on the view button, which is hard to see, but the little blue view here, if you click that, it will bring up all the information on that particular permit. Yeah. That is.
Question?
Okay.
John, go ahead. Go ahead with your question.
This one must have a microphone.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. John Justice, I appreciate the timeline and the explanation from the state engineer regarding well permitting and those grace periods for existing wells to submit applications. One thing I have a question about is, should we anticipate a timeline for existing non-exempt wells that have been previously permitted or permitted in that grace period to subsequently begin operation under a plan for augmentation or a substitute water supply plan in the near future? Or is that a later step for administration here? My experience is largely on the over-appropriated basins on the eastern slope and trying to get a sense on a transition into administration of wells going from virtually none to what now appears to be well administration. And so
I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Did you? I think because so the idea of the grace period is that it would be if they apply during that grace period time and that well existed or was applied, then they would not be considered to need an augmentation plan. If they apply after May 1st and they did not have, they were not in process of drilling their well or going through that process before May 1st, then yes, then they would be evaluated as if they needed to have as if the basin was over appropriated and would need an augmentation plan. And your question is about those particular cases?
no, I am used to regimes in the South Platte River where all wells, regardless of appropriation date or permitting date, are required to be augmented. And it is a concern that we would have that same level of compliance requirement for augmentation as to all wells that are non-exempt in the White River. But it sounds like you're telling me something different.
Yeah, I think I understand your question now. So the answer is yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
What happened to the microphone?
Well, it was causing, because we have a microphone on the computer so that people can hear online, it was causing some feedback. So if I step away from the computer, the question was for folks, the question was from John Justice, and his question was based upon his experience on the Front Range in the basins that are over appropriated and we do well administration, that all the wells that are not exempt are subject to administration and subject to the requirement for an augmentation plan. That the answer to that question, specific question, is it is different here because we are just now designating it as over appropriated. And we don't have well rules here for doing administration. Wells that were permitted prior to the basin becoming over appropriated continue to be able to operate without an augmentation plan. All the wells that are in existence now that are already permitted for non-exempt uses, the division is not going to go out and tell them all that they need to get an augmentation plan. Now, if you want to change your water right and move it to another location and drill a new well, that is when the over appropriated status would matter. Does that answer your question, John?
That's a very happy answer, and thank you.
Glad if I can provide happy answers.
Yeah.
For Travis.
So if you drill a well before the over appropriation and you don't put it in use until after the over appropriation, you don't have to get a augment plan. Is that correct?
If you were to drill a well
So you just
prior to May 1st or apply for the permit prior to May 1st,
if you get the well drilled and you don't put it into beneficial use, that's still okay, isn't it? You don't have
that,
to-
yes, because the time in which it's evaluated is when that well permit is
I
issued.
think that's kind of what his question might have been leading to is there's a lot of wells that have been drilled, not put into beneficial use yet. We just want to make sure that when they get put into beneficial use, we don't have to have an
That's correct. And that's where that, especially if it's drilled and it's not fully permitted yet, there's this grace period of time. If it's already permitted and drilled, it's just not being used, then it still qualifies as not needing an augmentation plan. It's a completely new well permit after May 1st, not contemplated before, not drilled, that would have to have an augmentation plan at that point.
Is there a certain time period that you have to put after it's deemed over appropriated, this area critical? When you drill the well, like on feed wells, you have a certain amount of time before you have to put it to use. Is that going to be the case for new wells? So like on a regular feed well, what is it, a year? You have a year after the well's drilled to put it to beneficial use, otherwise something that's like dealt with, they expire.
I am aware of the expiration occurring when you don't actually submit your well construction reports and things like that. But you're talking about when you don't submit your evidence of beneficial use.
For non-exempt.
I think if your well permit gets canceled because of that and you have to come back and get one, then yeah, you're going to need augmentation. Is that?
That is right, that's how.
I've got another online.
Okay.
Jonah, you could go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Christina. I was just wondering, I assume since there's a lack of storage reservoirs in the basin, that most of the augmentation plans moving forward will be based on, historic consumptive use credits, or, might use a private augmentation pond. But are there any plans potentially in the future to construct reservoirs for water users on the stream, or?
Did you guys, I'm gonna move away from that. I don't know if you heard the question, but more or less he's asking what kind of augmentation sources are we found today? And so to answer his question, right now your primary options are either to dry up land and change the historical consumptive use credits to an augmentation use, or to create your own augmentation plan with your own source. For example, historic consumptive use credits, or create your own pond that can be used to replace your depletions. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with, obviously, Lake Avery and the Yellow Jacket Water Conservancy District will have a water right for augmentation use that can be stored in that reservoir. And I say can be on the books, not necessarily literally, but they do at least have that water right for augmentation purposes to create a Lake Avery. Whether that potential for that water right to be stored in the reservoir and ultimately a plan developed, yet to be seen, but it's a potential option down the road. So right now, hopefully that answered his question, but options for augmentation supplies are very limited up here. Yeah, yes, dear.
I'd like to just springboard on that question. So I think everybody in the room, first of all, I want to thank Christina, by the way, who's super helpful with well problems.
Yes, everybody should take Christina's card.
So back to the augmentation, which sounds like, potentially going to be important. We have two proposals in this county. One is upriver expanding Lake Avery, and the other one is downriver at Wolf Creek. So my question is, in other areas of the state that have been over appropriated, what are the possibilities to take augmentation from downstream versus upstream? Is it an easier thing to have an upstream pool for augmentation purposes, or is that not an issue?
Yeah. Do you want to, I don't mind answering it, Mr. Brother.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I can tag on.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So we do, just to give you a sense, Jason referred to them as blanket augmentation plans. I refer to them as umbrella, but they're all the same thing. We do have umbrella augmentation plans in the Yampa. One at Stagecoach, where the Stagecoach Reservoir is the augmentation source. One at Steamboat Lake, on the Elk River, where Steamboat Lake is the augmentation source. And then many of you might be aware that Moffat County is actually in the process of getting an umbrella augmentation plan decreed through court with Elk and Reservoir as the replacement source. Why am I telling you this? Can Stagecoach replace depletions? Stagecoach Reservoir, can the water in Stagecoach Reservoir in that augmentation plan replace depletions above it? Yes, their plan does allow for a level of replacement of depletions upstream of the reservoir. Steamboat Lake, maybe a little bit. Moffat County's plan, yes, there's some level of replacement of depletions upstream of the reservoir. So, or even up tributaries. And how do they do that? They do that by something called exchange. So they can exchange water at the tributary. They're not exchanging a physical drop of water up these tributaries or even upstream of it, but it's an exchange to make sure that replacements are being made to still not injure any senior water right here. So you may not be able to exchange very high. And one example I tend to think of when we think of a lower basin replacement source is how far up the river could they actually exchange without injuring a senior water right holder. And the first place that comes to my mind when you think about it, there could be other limits on their exchange reach, but the first reach that comes to my mind is Peons Creek. And I don't mean going up Peons Creek. I think of the confluence of Peons Creek and the White River. And that point is meaningful to me and important to me as an administrator because the in-stream CWC, Colorado Water Conservation Board, has a water right that goes all the way down to Peons Creek. And just like any other water right holder, CWCB's water right cannot be injured either. So the idea is we'll allow exchange up to the point that it will not injure any senior water right holder on that system. So
Pretty much. I think she pretty much answered. I was just gonna, from my experience in the Gunnison Basin, there's a significant amount of augmentation water in the Aspinall unit. And they do the same thing where they can release water from the Aspinall unit. It gets delivered to the main stem of the Gunnison. The calling right that caused the entire Gunnison Basin to become over appropriated was the Redlands Power Canal, which is approximately a mile above the confluence with the Colorado. And so that water right can provide water to the senior water right holder so they can exchange past structures as long as they're not injuring anybody. So, I mean, it depends on I guess the answer I think is that it depends on the system and what water rights are there. So if there's a bunch of senior water rights that could potentially be injured, it's possibly more useful to have that bucket above those water rights so that you can provide water to them. If there's not, and you can exchange, then that might work as well. And to tag on to, I think, something she said earlier, a lot of people in the Gunnison Basin went, in the spring when there's a lot of water in the river, if they want to get an individual augmentation plan, they would choose to decree a small pond. And, the call period was not on those tributaries during the time of year when the spring runoff was occurring. So they could take water in spring runoff, put it in that pond, save it for the end of the season when they needed to provide that on water to the stream.
Is that, okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have one more question. My question is, does it ever occur that the status of over appropriation is decommissioned? And the reason I'm asking that question is we have the Taylor Draw Dam, which has put the two calls on the river. They've lost, I have to check my numbers again, but several $1 million over the last 5 years on that power plant. They've just taken out another $2.5 million loan to fix the turbine. So in the event that Conservancy District decided to decommission their dam and didn't need that much water to run the hydro plant, could you envision a situation where the river would not be over appropriated?
I'll answer from a statewide perspective, and then I'll let Erin answer. She's got more knowledge about the White River itself. I think that is something that has never happened before, just to be clear, that once an area becomes over appropriated, it's hard to imagine a condition where it would not be over appropriated, because a lot of times it's occurring because the supply and demand imbalance just is continuing to rise. I guess that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. I mean, I could see if there was a single water right that was the reason why I was over appropriated and that completely went away with no possibility of ever coming back. That's a pretty hard to imagine thing from happening. And like I said, I don't think it's ever happened. I don't think we've ever undeclared an area over appropriated.
What would it take to have it declared?
I don't think I can answer definitively what it would take. I think what I was trying to indicate is it would have to be pretty clear that that's just never going to happen. I mean, in the Gunnison Basin, the Redlands Power Canal called in 2002 and 2003 and has not called since that time. But it's hard as the entity that's regulating water rights and making sure that senior water rights get what it would be hard to start issuing non-exempt well permits, knowing that, even if it's 10 years down the road, that likely there's going to be a time at which there's going to be a call, because now you could have issued thousands of well permits, right? I mean, that's maybe an exaggeration for the White River, but you could have issued hundreds of well permits that are depleting the stream in that time period.
I don't need that.
Okay.
That's great.
I have one more question. I apologize, everybody, but there are a number of us, I suspect, we have several non-permitted solar wells in the BLM for livestock. And I asked the BLM about this. They had no knowledge of how to.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just
I'm
tired.
concerned that this status. is going to
No, I know. I'm just listening.
affect,
What's up?
Situation, which is very concerning to those of us in the livestock business.
Christina, have you gotten any answers to
I
that?
do not have an answer.
What's
the question?
Oh, I thought that Christina had been looking into that for you, Deirdre, and I'm not even sure I would understand the process or familiar with the process on BLM, whether you yourself can file for that well permit on BLM land or if BLM would need to do it. The job's saying it sounded like BLM needs to do it.
Does it happen anywhere else in the state? Maybe it's a non-issue. I just don't want to get caught not being able to use those wells.
I'm not familiar with it. It probably has happened. One question I have for you though is how old are those wells?
Well, some are before 1972, Travis.
Okay. So you don't necessarily have to get a register.
The ones after 1972, don't they?
Oh, they're after. I thought they were
Some
prior.
are after.
No,
some
they're
are-
after 1972. Okay. Yeah, they do. They would. All right. Well, let us keep looking into that and doing research. Yeah, Travis.
The one benefit is most of them are on parcels that are bigger than 35 acres.
Yeah,
So you
absolutely.
need to-
You still would need to get a well permit. I think you said yours are unpermitted, right? The ones you're referring to, the solar wells are unpermitted.
But you'll be able to still, since they're bigger.
What's that?
You'll still be able to get
you would be able to get
Since
a
they're
permit.
bigger, 35 acres.
Yeah, and I don't know if people did catch that in our slides. It was in there, but if you weren't paying real close attention, if you do have a lot for more than 35 acres, or yeah, if you can designate 35 acres to a well, you can get it for livestock watering. And I think a lot of people are not aware of that. And that's an exempt, that would be an exempt livestock watering well that does not have to be augmented. Did you say?
No, I've got another
Okay, Jeff. Yeah.
question, sorry. Can you explain what the process is if you get a well permit afterward, deemed critical? Get a well permit on the 35 acres, so it'll be an exempt permit, and then you subdivide that 35 acres. Do you have to go in and change the status on that permit because it's not tied to the 35 acres anymore? Or what would be the process in that?
Well, let me ask you this, what's the well permitted for? That's maybe the first question. 3 dwellings, 5 dwellings? I mean, is it
On
gonna,
35 acres, it's permitted for 35 acres, 3 dwellings, 1 acre of water. They go in there and they subdivide it into 4 lots or 3 lots. Do they have to go in and change well permit for less than 35?
yes, that is my understanding, they do.
Yes.
They can't share that.
It's, yeah, I mean, the exemption is 3 single-family dwellings on a single lot. I mean, and the idea was that the legislature wasn't providing a exemption for people to subdivide their properties and use this as a way to get around having to fund water supply somewhere, because it does have an impact to the stream. And so, yeah.
Did you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I'm in real estate, and I periodically will run into wells that either maybe they had at least the initial application, but maybe not the final permit. So they might not be as old as 72, but like say in the 80s. How should I help some of those sellers fix those problems before we
Well, I do think great resources are used, going to be Christina. But generally, if somebody has a well and it's not permitted yet, I recommend they come get it permitted before May 1. And actually not even May 1. If the well has been drilled, we're saying you have until December 31st to come and get your well permit for that.
What happens after that? So you have a well that was drilled in 85 and it's been used this whole time. The older couple doesn't even realize that they didn't have it permitted or whatever the case might be. Happens next.
If they haven't applied for it,
Yeah, so if that well is functional, they've been used since the 80s, but it wasn't correctly permitted, or not permitted.
it's going to all depend on their lot size and what their uses are. If their lot size is 10 acres and they've been using it for outdoor lawn and garden and few horses, they're going to have to augment that well to get a well permit for those uses. Otherwise, it's going to be limited to in-house use only if they let December 31st come and go. Yeah. Yes.
Explain to me how a well 250 feet deep is affecting the river. Because if I'm bringing the water up, it's getting back into the river, not staying down at 256 feet.
Yeah. Well, you should probably just write it.
I mean,
It is-
$10,000 for a well, now you're telling me I gotta do something different with it.
Well, I mean, I guess we're telling you that if you get a well permit now, then you don't have to do any augmentation. But your first question was, how does it affect the stream? And so I wish I had a slide in here with some diagrams of the groundwater system. But if you are drilling a well in an alluvial aquifer, okay, but in an alluvial aquifer, which means it's water that's sitting in the gravel, sands, material that is connected to the river. There's no confining layer. It's not, below a layer that's keeping it under pressure. That is connected to the river. The river is connected to the groundwater. And so some of the base flow in your stream, base flow in the White River, is coming from the ground. If you drill a 250-foot well and you pump it, it's causing what we call a cone of depression. which is depressing the groundwater table, which is taking water out of the system that was returning to the stream. It may return to the stream. It may have returned to the stream in 10 months, but it would have returned to the stream. And so you are actually depriving the stream of water. Now, if you drill a well into a confined layer, or what we call non-tributary water, that's different. It's not tributary to the stream, but there aren't any non-tributary aquifers that I am aware of in the White River Basin. They exist in the Rio Grande, in the South Platte, and in the Arkansas, very deep wells that they can pump non-tributary water. And that water, the right to use that water is based upon your ownership of the land overlying the aquifer. But for tributary water, which is almost all groundwater on the western slope, it's tributary to the stream.
So if I go get this permit, is it backdated for water rights to when I had the well drilled? Or am I starting from the permit time and that's my water rights?
Well, I mean, you're not, if you get a permit, you're not necessarily getting a water right. You could certainly go to water court and get a water right for your well.
Then why did I permit?
Because all wells in Colorado must have a permit.
All wells in Colorado.
Since 1957, actually.
Well, I was permitted when it was drilled. So now I gotta get another one from you?
No, if it has a permit, you don't have to do anything.
Okay.
If you already have a permit, nothing happens. You can still use it for whatever uses it was permitted for. You can continue to do that with no impact. So if it's permitted, that's fine. What we're trying to make sure everybody knows, and the reason we're doing, that Aaron set up this stakeholder meeting is so that you all understand and hopefully can get the word out in the community that if you don't have one, but you need one, or you think you would need one, that you have a couple of months to file for that application. Or if you've already drilled it and you don't have a permit, it's one of these situations where it was drilled a while ago and it doesn't have a permit, because I just said all wells must have a permit. But as we all know, there's probably wells out there that don't have a permit, right? So those people should come in and get a permit before May 1st or before December 31st if it was already there. If it was already pumping, you have until December 31st. So the goal is to get the word out and make sure everybody that can qualify for that takes advantage of it.
You might mention that a permit's good for 2 years. You have 2 years from the time you get the permit, so it has to be drilled. So it's not like you have to get the permit, get it drilled right now. You got 2 years before the permit expires. For example.
Yeah, so Travis was indicating to just let everybody, you have two years, for example, is to drill the well after you ask for the permit or apply for the permit.
I'll only add maybe then after, if that 2 years starts to come up and you haven't drilled your well, you can request an extension. You are allowed 1-year extensions. On the other hand, if you have a non-exempt well permit or get a non-exempt well permit, say to dig a pond that you know is going to intercept groundwater, you have 1 year to construct the well and then a 1-year extension and only 1-year extension.
Currently, we have a legislative bill right now that's just intended to make our well permitting processes more efficient, and it actually extends that period to 2 years from 1 year. So House Bill 25-1014. So hopefully that will be passing the legislature shortly.
Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Yeah, John?
I want some clarification about the total amount of water at the Watson Gauge, 440,000 acre feet. So what happens to the consumptive number? I think in the White River, it's something over 50,000 acre feet of consumptive use. How does that weigh in on the total amount of water produced by the White River?
Well, I guess what you could, in a way you could say, well, if that 50,000 acre feet wasn't being consumed,
Yeah, it's,
then it'd be available there.
no, it's estimated that there's just over 50,000 acre feet of consumptive use, with the irrigation, industrial, all those things. What happens to that number? If nobody used any water, would the Watson gauge say 490 instead of 440?
I think we're assuming, but yeah, that would be the assumption.
So when we look at the total amount of water the White River produces, we're not including consumptive use. Is that correct?
These are actual gauge values.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's 50,000 acre feet that evaporated.
Yeah.
That's not, so the White River actually produced more than what the Watson gauge indicates. No?
Oh, sure. But if you remember, the overappropriation is about supply and demand,
No,
right? There's been a greater demand, or, I mean, there was certainly a lesser demand. I mean, you can make that same change. If you're gonna make the change to the 440,000, what was it in 1924 at 520? What were the consumptive uses? So if we're going to add back in the historical consumptive use, you need to add it in along the entire graph from 1924 to 2024 so that you get a more representative aspect of what did just the supply unimpacted by man look like, if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm trying to get an understanding of how that total flow is assessed. So we're using over 50,000 acre feet of consumptive use on the White River. Maybe in 1940 it was only 10,000 acre feet.
Sure.
Does anybody keep track of those numbers?
Well, maybe even if we did, and let's just put numbers on there, then we're looking at 530,000 versus 400 and 490. That doesn't change what we have happening today. We have 50,000 acre feet of consumptive use, and that is likely growth. If it was 10,000 100 years ago and it's 50,000 today, where is it going to be in 50 years from now?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, where is that 50,000 acre feet that just dissolve, or is it added to the Watson gauge?
Well-
We're trying to understand how much water the White River produces. It's the Watson gauge plus the consumptive use.
Sure, that's the number you want to look at.
Is that a number you all are seeking and that keep track of?
No, I mean, it's not something I could certainly produce the numbers if I wanted, but I don't know that it's some number I need for any of my evaluations.
Okay, just curious.
I mean, for Erin's and her staff's water right administration, it matters mostly what's available at the head gate of the structure that's making a call for water. And so if the head gate, if the location on the stream doesn't have enough water to satisfy the demand, then, I mean, some of this total amount of volume that's gone past the gate doesn't really matter. This is just showing that there has been a decline in supply over the last 100 years. That is part of the reason why we're here today, probably. Whether that decline was 80,000 acre feet or 60,000 acre feet, it doesn't really have a bearing on the fact that the water right hasn't been receiving, or hasn't in a number of times now received the amount that it's entitled to.
Understand that from an administrative point, but now we have, maybe I'm getting a little broader on my question, but we have a compact agreement. So the lower states might say, hey, you guys in the White River, you're using 100,000 acre feet in 2030, and you're consuming more water when you're supposed to be delivering that water to the downstream users according to the compact agreement.
Well, so I think I can pretty simply answer that question. The Upper Colorado River Commission is the one that would be evaluating total consumptive use in the Colorado River, the upper division states. Colorado and the total upper division states, which is Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Colorado, have used a maximum consumptive use, so that includes the consumptive use on the White River, of around 5 million acre feet out of the 7.5 million acre feet that the compact allocated. And so I don't think they haven't attempted to make hay with any argument that, hey, you're continuing to increase your use, because they at least at a minimum understand that we are still under the 7.5. That doesn't mean that they're not arguing right now that we should share in the pain that that we think is primarily needs to be borne in the lower basin, because they've been using over their allocation. So I don't, if that's the concern, I think it's not something that concerns me at this point.
Thank you. I just thought that 50,000 acre feet needs to be measured somehow. It's an important number.
And the Upper Colorado River Commission, we're getting maybe off topic on this tonight, but it's good since you're all here, is probably going to be moving to using what's called remote sensed consumptive use data. There's a bunch of different methodologies that you can use to use satellite data, and it evaluates basically the colors on the ground and can calculate based on a vegetative index how much water is being consumed by the crops. And then you look at what was diverted to those fields and all that. We have a lot of GIS folks that work on that. So using that to calculate the consumptive use for all the 4 upper division states going forward. So we are calculating it. We have probably some estimates from the 1920s, but not as good a data as we've had in the last 30 years.
Thank you.
Christina, did we have a question online or we?
No. Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, okay.
Not sure how to explain this. If if a farmer were to change his irrigation methods from, say, an inefficient method, maybe like flood irrigation, and change to sprinklers or something more efficient, could that be deemed as an augmentation? Some of those acreage be recovered as part of the augmentation. Does that make sense?
Right now, here in this basin, you do not need to do any augmentation or change anything as a result of going from flood to sprinkler, which is more efficient. So that's different in the Arkansas, but not up here.
I think maybe the question was, are you asking whether when you switch to a more efficient irrigation system, can you use that water as an augmentation source?
Oh, no. Yeah, no.
So no, you cannot, because the crop is consuming the same. If you have a full supply, so if you fully supplied your crop by flooding it and you switch to sprinkler irrigation for whatever reason, and you fully supply your crop with a sprinkler, your alfalfa, your hay, your grass hay uses the same amount and consumes. So you're increasing your efficiency, but you're not actually saving any water in the system. Augmentation replacement sources have to actually provide water to the system to replace. So the system's the same whether you use a sprinkler or flood. Ostensibly, actually, if you switch to a sprinkler, I would contend it's more, because typically you can accomplish more irrigation with a sprinkler than you can with flood because of the efficiencies. You can use less water to accomplish the same consumptive use. Sorry.
I'm glad you understood that question. Yeah, any other questions? All right. Well, we're gonna hang around. Again, Christina's here. She can probably field a few questions tonight, but otherwise, I encourage you to pick up a card from her, and she's always available. And then Willie and Betty and Debbie and I are here too. So if you have any questions, feel free to hang out. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Good job.